This is episode 341 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Join today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Alan Stewart, author of Shakespeare's Letters. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
James wanted that outcome. He wanted somebody to say, we were trying to kill you because you're such a good and godly king. And that's what they end up saying. Shakespeare gets some of the material from Macbeth, from that case.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Shakespeare made the three witch sisters famous in his play Macbeth by showcasing their manipulative power, incantations, and their famous pot of double, toil, and trouble. While this version of witches makes for a fun spoof at Halloween parties today, when Shakespeare was originally bringing these sisters to life on stage, witches were not only considered real beings, but were thought to be clandestine actors, hiding their real identity behind normal appearances so as to be better positioned to inflict harm on others. Everything from natural disasters to household accidents could be blamed on this kind of magic, and seemingly innocuous actions like speaking sharp words, having the wrong birthmark, or sometimes just owning the wrong kind of house pet could all land people, and women in particular, in a fight for their lives at a witch trial, where they were often hopelessly charged with proving their innocence against charges of witchcraft. Most of these individual stories have been lost to history and relegated to a list of names on an accusation list. But our guest this week seeks to bring the real-life stories of actual women who were tried as witches to the fore with her latest book titled Witchcraft, A History and 13 Trials, that takes a look at 13 specific witch trials from the 16th to 18th centuries. Here today to help us understand the history of how someone would find themselves accused of witchcraft, what was involved in the process of an official witch trial, and the real events blamed on witchcraft that had a powerful influence on King James I of England, and Shakespeare when he wrote his play Macbeth, is expert in the history of witches and returning guest to our show, Dr. Marion Gibson. Professor Marion Gibson is a specialist in witchcraft and magic in literature. Her research investigates the relationships between writings about magic and the supernatural. She has written several books on representations of witchcraft, magic, and the Renaissance, including Early Modern Witches, Witchcraft Cases in Contemporary Writing, and Rediscovering Renaissance Witchcraft, a book examining the ways in which 16th and 17th century writings on witchcraft have continued to inspire modern literature. She joins us today to share the history of witches that intersects with Shakespeare's lifetime that she researched for her latest book, Witchcraft, A History and 13 Trials. Learn more about Marion and see a list of more books she's published on Shakespeare and witches in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Marion. Welcome back to That Shakespeare Life. It's very nice to have you visit with us again, especially to share about your latest book on witch trials just in time for Halloween.
Thanks for having me back, Cassidy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with definitions. Marion's book defines magic and defines witches, but states that the magic of witches and demons was not the same power as the supernatural force of God. Marion, what was the difference between God's power over the universe and what people in Shakespeare's lifetime would have called magic?
Magic was really important in the early modern world, as I'm sure people know, but it was conceived in different ways. So whilst the church was believed to have a certain amount of magic as part of it, that was God's magic. So it was far superior to anything that ordinary mortals might be practicing. And again, God's power was seen to be completely different to the power of the devil. It was more, it was bigger. It was really the only power that mattered in the universe. Whereas the pitiful attempts of demons, people, other creatures to practice magic was very much seen as a kind of lesser, minor, undermining thing, which God could overrule at any point if he chose to do so, but which sometimes he might make use of. So, he might get the devil or witches to do something like punish a sinful person, which he didn't want to do himself, or he thought there was a better way of doing it. But ultimately, people thought he was in control of the entire universe. And so his magic, the magic of the established church, was really the only magic that mattered.
In her book, Marion describes what she calls the, quote, career witch as being someone whose villainization was a product of the Protestant Reformation, writing that before the 15th century, most churchmen regarded healers and diviners as, quote, mild sinners who couldn't do much harm, end quote. After the Reformation, heretics were being burned at the stake and witches were easily added to this category. Marion, as you research the history of witch trials, if someone would be a career witch, implied a series of well-established life choices, as opposed to being found once with a familiar or something similar that might incriminate someone as a witch. What have you noticed about how long someone was able to practice as a diviner or a healer, for example, before they crossed that line into the place where people felt punishment was necessary for their behavior? Was suspicion of practicing magic enough for someone to be brought to trial, or was there some kind of 3 strikes and you're out evaluation period first?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, that the world was essentially divided into good and bad in a very binary way. Being a career witch would really imply that you'd made a deliberate choice to join the evil side. And you would probably be seen as having worked towards that through committing early kinds of sins. So, for example, people who were suspected of witchcraft were often people who had a sexual history, for example, that their community disapproved of, or had previously been seen as thieving, or had been seen as immoral in some way, or irreligious, impious, belonging to the wrong religion. All of those kind of things were the sort of sin that people thought would lead you down the road towards becoming a witch. So it could be that a person was really preparing to enter the career of witchcraft, if you like, for their whole life. Maybe 20 years before they'd had an illegitimate child and their community had looked at them and said, this is a bad woman. And then 20 years later, somebody would say, do you know, I think that person has bewitched my child, or they've bewitched my farm, and I'm not making any money anymore. So it was seen as a progression, but there was a definite moment when somebody entered into witchcraft, and that moment would be seen as the moment when they finally irrevocably committed to the devil. So often witches were imagined as having signed a pact with Satan, whether that was a written pact or something that was done by, for example, giving blood to a demon, a familiar spirit. It didn't really matter how the pact was made. The idea was that an agreement had been made, that the witch had finally handed his or her soul over to the devil, and that there was really no way back for them. So yeah, it was a process of a kind of long drift, if you like, into a position where Satan could finally claim you for his.
If there's a connection between healing and being a witch, and most medical doctors of Shakespeare's lifetime were male, why weren't more men accused of being witches?
It is a puzzle, isn't it? And I think it's mostly to do with the ways in which that society was very hierarchical. So again, a bit like the idea of magic. If it's God's magic, it's fine. If it's somebody else's magic, that's lesser. And I think it was the same with all kinds of knowledge. This was an era when women didn't have access to formal medical training. They couldn't enter the professions of law or teaching. They couldn't become magistrates. They could no longer, at least in Protestant countries, commit to a full-time religious life, and they couldn't become priests in any of the Christian sects. So they were immediately disadvantaged. Immediately their life experience was set aside, so that anything they did, whether that was practicing healing or practicing magic or professing some kind of religious belief, was automatically seen as not official, therefore possibly suspect.
What was the process of a witch trial? How was someone convicted of being a witch? Was there a jury, or were there tests performed to reveal witchcraft in someone?
Yeah, that's right. Across Europe and North America, of course, this differed from place to place because different European areas, countries, nations jurisdictions had their own rules, and each American colony also had its own rules, its own government. But if we're thinking specifically about Shakespeare's England, then it was a process of jury trial. So if somebody was suspected of witchcraft, say they'd reached the point where people had thought, this person is definitely a witch, they've definitely committed to Satan, we must do something about them. They would complain about that person, their neighbour, to the local magistrate. And the magistrate would question the suspected witch and question the person who accused them. And then he would send off all that evidence to the formal criminal trial known as the assize trial, which would happen in one of the big county towns. The person would be committed to jail in the meantime, so they'd be put on remand, effectively awaiting their trial. And then they'd be taken to a jury trial. First of all, there was a grand jury, which is very like the American system now. We no longer have grand juries in Britain, but the American system still does. So it's a really interesting example of something that Shakespeare would have recognised instantly in America that he would have missed back at home in England. So the case goes to the grand jury, and the grand jury decides whether they think there is an immediately obvious case to answer or whether they think there's something wrong with it. The indictment's maybe been drawn up wrong or something like that, in which case they could throw it out. But more often than not, the grand jury would say, yeah, this is fine, we need to try this. They would forward the matter to the petty jury, so the little jury of 12 people, 12 men, of course, in this period, who would actually decide the verdict. And the trial would be held in front of those 12 men and a judge sitting on the bench at the front of the court. The accused person would be questioned, would maybe have the opportunity to make a small amount of defence, and then would be judged one way or the other, guilty or not guilty. Most of the trials took very short periods of time. So we're talking 10, 15, 20 minutes at most for somebody to make some kind of answer to the charge that they are a witch. Then the jury sit on the matter, make a decision, the verdict is announced, and then at the end of the day, at the end of the assize court sitting, the sentences are carried out. So somebody could literally spend 10 minutes pleading for their life, lose the argument, and at the end of the day, they would be hanged as a witch.
Now, we've seen woodcut images of people being tried as a witch, and they included things like dunking them in water and other kinds of tests. 10 to 20 minutes of a trial doesn't seem nearly long enough to have performed those kinds of evaluative methods, ever how gruesome they are. But when did that kind of thing happen? Was this before or after the official court trial?
That would be before. So yes, you're absolutely right. There were pre-stages sometimes. They weren't part of the official legal process. So this would be something that a community would do if they thought there was a strong suspicion somebody was a witch. They might take them off to the local river or maybe to a mill pond, tie them up in a particular way so that it would be quite difficult for them to swim, then throw them in and see what happened. And of course, people will know that if they did manage to swim or float on the water, the community would tend to decide that they were probably guilty. It was one of the ways that communities made a decision about whether to take somebody to the magistrate. So all this would predate the formal court trial. And quite often people were told off in court for doing this kind of thing. Judges didn't really like it. Magistrates didn't really like it on the whole either. So it would be the kind of build up to the trial where that kind of thing would take place. And sometimes people they were held in isolation by their community. They would be watched 24 hours a day to see if any of their demonic familiars came to them. They'd be walked up and down the room so that they couldn't sleep, they couldn't focus. We think of that as torture now. They didn't think about it that way at the time. Torture was illegal in Shakespeare's England, except for things like heresy, political crime, and so on. For witchcraft, you should not be tortured. However, people who were suspected of witchcraft were basically subjected to torturous practices before the trial. So by the time you got in front of the magistrate, there was actually quite a lot of presupposition that you were guilty, and it was really quite difficult for people to reverse that at that point.
Was anyone who made it to trial for possibly being a witch ever acquitted or sent home saying, no, we conclude that you are not a witch, as we had previously suspected? Or did they all end in execution?
No, they didn't. I mean, it was a proper jury trial. It may be by the standards of our time, we see it as very, very misguided and very unjust. But by the standards of Shakespeare's time, people did think that they were doing the right thing. And therefore, that meant that some people would get off. Some people would be acquitted. Sometimes even things like, an accuser would not show up in court. And at that point, the person essentially had to be just discharged and they wouldn't have anything to answer. But yes, quite a large proportion of people were acquitted. It's not ever possible to say exactly what that proportion is, because sometimes when somebody was acquitted, the record was thrown away. So we know that we've lost quite a lot of that evidence. But we do know, yes, absolutely, of people who went back to their community, sometimes to be accused again later on in their lives, which is, a pretty shocking thing. I don't know what their lives would have been like when they went back to their villages, having been acquitted. The problem was that the neighbours, having built up all this suspicion, were fairly unlikely to accept that somebody actually was innocent. So I suspect the people who were sent home actually had a pretty miserable time after that. But yes, you could be acquitted, you could be freed. And if you were, that meant that you wouldn't be subjected to a further trial on those offences. If people wanted to try you, they'd have to come up with new ones.
One of the most famous witch trials that occurred during Shakespeare's lifetime was the Berwick witch trials, which lasted an astonishing 2 years and accused a massive group of people. I believe it was over 70 people all at one time of being witches. Marion, these trials took place in Scotland, but were these trials reported on in England? Would Shakespeare have known about this event? And why was it so different from the ones you've told us about previously?
Yes, he wouldn't have known about these events, absolutely. And the witches in Macbeth seem to some extent to be based on these trials. They were held at this place called North Berwick in Scotland. And because it's a Scottish trial, it's a different set of circumstances to the English cases that I've been talking about. Scotland was a separate country from England then. I mean, it still is now. It's a separate nation, but it's part of the same political unit and therefore many of the same legal practices, although by no means all of them still apply. But in Scotland in Shakespeare's time, things were very different. There was far less of a centralised legal system. So if somebody was sucked into the legal system, having been accused of witchcraft, they might be tried in a variety of different ways. They might have a jury trial of sort of the kind that I've described already. They might be sent to a church court, which would be a completely different thing, separate from the state, and actually held quite often in their local parish church. They might be sent to the royal court for trial. And this is what happened to the North Berwick witches. They were from an area around the Scottish capital of Edinburgh. And they were taken to be questioned by the king himself and his privy council, so his inner circle, his inner cabinet, if you like, of advisors. They were subjected to torture because Scotland did allow torture in cases of witchcraft. And so having been terribly brutally treated and paraded before the monarch, these people stood very, very little chance of proving their innocence. That trial did go on for a very, very long time. And certainly the people had quite a lot of opportunity to tell stories to the court. But the trouble was that they had been tortured. They were traumatized. They'd been torn away from their communities. We know that some of them had children. Some of them had left families behind them. They were utterly desperate. And they did end up confessing to holding these enormous demonic gatherings where they met Satan himself and they danced and sang with Satan and feasted. And they ended up confessing that they tried to kill the king himself. They tried to kill him in order to replace him with his cousin, the Earl of Bothwell, they said. And I think they ended up confessing that because they were under so much pressure to do so. And James himself, who was King of Scotland, then subsequently becomes King of England as well, which is one of the ways those two nations get unified into the modern United Kingdom. James wanted that outcome. He wanted somebody to say, we were trying to kill you because you're such a good and godly king. And that's what they end up saying. Shakespeare gets some of the material from Macbeth, from that case, though. So, for example, one of the things the witches confess is that they sailed in sieves. And people probably remember that in Macbeth, that's one of the things that the Scottish witches say. In a sieve, there's a sail, they say. And that comes directly out of the mouths of those suspects from North Berwick near Edinburgh in the 1590s. So we know that Shakespeare did know about that case. It's very likely that he read a kind of early newspaper account of it that was published in England as well as being published in Scotland.
In the 16th century, there was a woman named Gellis. Am I saying her name correctly? She was known as Gilly Duncan, but she was accused of being a witch. And as it happens, she is also the first known British player of the instrument known as the mouth harp. Marion, why was Gilly accused of being a witch? And did those suspicions have anything to do with her playing the harmonica?
Yes, you said that right. Absolutely. That was what she was called. And she was a servant. So we think she was probably quite young. She served in the house of her local magistrate, if you like, the Scottish version of those English magistrates that I was talking about earlier. And I'm afraid this man subjected her to his own kind of torture. So he put the thumb screws on her to crush her fingers and try to get her to confess to being a witch. And she did confess. And this really kicks off the whole of the North Berwick case. She did say, absolutely, as she talked about her activity, she said that she played this musical instrument, sometimes known as a Jew's harp. It's that kind of zingy instrument that people will know about. And she ended up confessing that she'd led the witches in a dance when they'd all met together with Satan. And she'd played on this instrument, and she was kind of the ringleader, the Pied Piper for the others, if you like. So Gilly was a really important figure and just plucked out of obscurity, you know, this very ordinary servant woman, dragged off to the royal court, and she was forced to perform on this instrument in front of the king himself. So we have this astonishing moment of theatre. And I think surely that's one of the things that must have interested Shakespeare when he read about this case. We have this astonishing moment of theatre when the witches, as he thinks they are, have to dance in front of him, singing and dancing and playing the harp and all the rest of it. It's an astonishing moment. I talk about it in the second chapter of my book, and I put it there because I think it's a really good introduction to some of the things that witches are thought to do in Shakespeare's time when they really went for it, when they really went mad with their satanic conspiracy. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that's popping around in the back of his head when he writes Macbeth. You know, he's thinking about witches, he's thinking about their entertainment value and how interesting they are to look at and indeed listen to when they sing and dance. He's thinking about their relationship with kings. And that's the kind of driver behind Macbeth, isn't it? It's that the witches have intervened in politics in this disastrous way, and they have to be held to account. But interestingly, in his play, he doesn't really go along with the outcome of that witch trial, which was, you know, that they were held to account. He actually diverts from that, and he allows his witches to go away unscathed. By the end of the play, we're not even really sure they're witches, actually. They're not really like Annie and Gilly from North Berwick. They're like some sort of ethereal spirits or fairies or something like that. So I'm not sure what he thought of the case, but I know that he knew about it.
King James was intimately involved in the accusation of witches on a grand scale and has his own massive story we could tell. But another woman who was prosecuted by King James for being a witch was Agnes Sampson. Marion, tell us Agnes's story and what happened at her trial.
Agnes was accused alongside Gilly. She was known as Annie. That was her nickname, in the same way that Gellis was called Gilly. And she was a slightly different type of woman. She was a mother, we know, because she talks about some of her children. And in fact, her daughter was accused alongside of her and meets the same fate as her mother, I'm sorry to say. She was quite poor. She talks about the way that she lives in poverty. And she says, really touchingly, there's this really touching human moment. She says she had to share a bed with her children in order to keep warm. You know, they lived in some very small place and they were cold and they were hungry. And one of the ways that she earned money was rather like Gilly. She did other things alongside whatever it was that she did for an ordinary living, which we don't actually know. She said that she set herself up as a healer, as a kind of magical fortune-telling, healing woman. And she would go around in her community and say these prayers and charms over people, which she thought would heal them. She said that she learned them from her father. And some of them are absolutely mainstream Christian. It's really interesting to see the way in which, as we were saying earlier, almost any kind of utterance by a woman could become suspicious, even if it's the most Christian thing you ever heard. So Gilly's saying these prayers, versions of the Christian creed that people say in church, and people are pointing the finger at her and saying, but you're a witch. It was very difficult for her to exit from that position, and she didn't, in fact, manage it. She was tortured in the same way as Gilly was, and again forced to speak directly with the king. She ends up telling the king, woman to man, this amazing story about how she supposedly knew what he had said to his new wife, Anne of Denmark, on their wedding night. She describes an occasion when she tells him about an attempt to poison him, which interestingly makes use of toads and poison and other things that turn up in Macbeth as well. And she ends up confessing all this stuff about how the witches christened a cat, she said, and threw it into the sea as this sort of barbaric anti-Christian rite, and how the witches attacked King James at sea when he was bringing his new wife back from Denmark, and all this stuff. So Annie's evidence alongside Gilly's is really the kind of the backbone of the case that Shakespeare knew. He gets a lot of his stories, he gets a lot of the energy of his witchcraft stories from those two women.
To explore further the stories of individuals accused of witchcraft, including more details on the story of Gilly Duncan and Agnes Sampson, and further details about King James's development into a witch hunter and demonologist, along with just a myriad of stories into the 18th century about witches and their trials, you want to read Marion's book. It's titled Witchcraft, A History and 13 Trials, which our conversation today has shared pieces of. If you enjoy this history, then that's your first stop, is to get a copy of Marion's latest book. It's available now on Amazon and wherever books are sold. Of course, I will have a direct link to this book available in the show notes for today's episode as well. Marion, having completed this book, you are undoubtedly the best person to ask for suggestions on where we should begin to learn more about the history of witches and witchcraft. In addition to your latest book, what resources would you say are the most important to start with when we want to learn more?
I think there are a whole slew of things that you can look at. And I know that you're going to provide some of those in the show notes. There are some really interesting other podcasts about witches. There's a lovely article which shows you a series of images of witches. So there are some lovely woodcuts which show you really visually what Shakespeare's world of witches would have looked like. So there are witches, dancing with their animal familiars. There are witches casting spells. There are witches meeting with the devil. And there's a lovely illustration of the North Berwick witches themselves, which was in that pamphlet that I believe Shakespeare read. So we can actually look at the same images that he looked at and think about what the world of witches might have looked like. There's also a lot of scholars writing about witchcraft now, whether that's in Shakespeare's plays, and I suggested a book by Eric Pudney, which looks at witches in drama really across the period from the Middle Ages, so plays that Shakespeare would have seen himself and would have known about, right the way through to the Jacobean, the Caroline period that comes after Shakespeare and is influenced by his plays. So people might want to take a look at that as well. I think it's a really rich area. I think there's so much. People in this period thought a lot about witches, and whether they thought about them visually or they thought about them on stage or they read texts about them or they heard sermons about them in church or they chatted about them in the pub. I think witches were ever present for these people. So there are lots of different places that people can go to find out more about them.
Ahead of our podcast, Marion sent over a really great list of resources just for you, and I will make sure that the entire list and direct links to those images and other resources she's mentioned today get put in the show notes. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, as you know, Marion, from your previous visit with us, and I don't remember what you picked last time, so you have a clean slate with me to pick whatever you like, but we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yes, they're good choices, aren't they? I think first I probably said a Victorian novel called Middlemarch, but I may not have done. I don't remember either. However, this time I'm going to go for a novel by the Canadian novelist Kate Pullinger, and it's called Weird Sister, and we all know where she got that phrase from. Oh, look, it's Macbeth again. And Weird Sister is about another case that Shakespeare may have known about, where an entire family of three people, mum, dad, and their daughter, all get accused of witchcraft in the 1590s in the English Midlands, where Shakespeare was from. And it's the story, it's a fictionalized version, not of that story itself, but a kind of what if. And the what if that Kate Pullinger thinks about is, What if the daughter came back centuries later? What if she got to take revenge on the family, the descendants of the people who had prosecuted her? So I think it's a really great idea. You take an original source that Shakespeare might have known. This is another case that a news pamphlet was published about. And then you think, well, what does that mean today? What do we do with that? You know, what's the best story we could possibly tell about one of those people, which isn't a story of victimization. It's a story of revenge. And it's a rip-roaring yarn, I would say. I really like Weird Sister. It's out of print, I believe, so people may be able to get a second-hand copy of it. But I really, really recommend it. Weird Sister by Kate Pullinger.
What a fitting selection for your deserted island, and an exciting choice. What an interesting story. So what's next for you?
Next for me, I'm moving on to more witches. It won't surprise you to know I am obsessed with them. And I'm looking after Shakespeare's time now. So I'm looking at the English Civil War, which comes along in the late 1630s and 1640s and really tears England, as well as Scotland and Ireland and Wales, the whole of the now United Kingdom, apart. And I'm looking at a case that people might have heard of, which is known as the Witchfinder General case, when a witch hunter called Matthew Hopkins decides that he's going to find witches across eastern England. And he ends up, and the people who work with him, his associates, end up prosecuting between 200 and 300 people. This is a really important precursor to Salem. You know, when I write about it, I think people will see the similarities with Salem, where you get a similar number of accused people. You get that sense that the witch hunt is just rippling out across the country from its relatively modest beginnings. So I'm really looking forward to telling that story in my next book. I don't have a title yet. It'll probably be about a year, 18 months. It's going to take ages to research, but there is another one coming, and I'm looking forward to writing that.
Well, we will look forward to seeing it come to fruition. It does sound very exciting and lots of good research ahead of you. So we'll look forward to seeing that come to life. Marion Gibson, thank you so much for sharing this history and exciting information on our show today. We have learned a lot more about the history of witchcraft and witch trials in Shakespeare's lifetime, and it's been fun speaking with you.
Thank you, Cassidy. Thank you, listeners. Pleasure to be here.
As I mentioned earlier, direct links to all of the resources Marion recommends for you today, along with more information on her work and the books that she's published on the history of witches and witch trials, are all available in the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 341. That's CassidyCash.com/EP341. While you're at that show notes page, if you would like to see more in-depth research into the history of witches, witchcraft, and the history of witch trials, including some of these images that Shakespeare would have seen that Marion talks about today, along with links to primary documents of the actual witch trials and the people who were accused and what they said, if you'd like to see all of that more in-depth and visually based history, then hit the Become a Patron button on the show notes page. There, you can not only join us as a patron, but you can log in using your Patreon credentials if you are already a supporter of our show, and all the bonus content will expand right on the show notes page. Extras include woodcuts, illustrations, primary documents, museum artifacts, and more, all related to the history of our conversation today. It's a great way to go beyond the episode and dive further into the history. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 341. That Shakespeare Life is made possible by listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. Patrons of our show get unlimited access to our detailed show notes, over 150 bonus episodes of our show, and special insider extras, including a video library, animated versions of Shakespeare's plays, and educator resources that coordinate not only with our show, but of course with Shakespeare's plays. You can find out more and explore all the extras at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a happy, fun, and safe Halloween celebration this year, and I thank you for joining us for our spooky-themed episode here today. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.